The year was 1941, and the world was burning. In Europe, Hitler's armies had swallowed Poland, France, and much of the continent. The Blitz had rained fire on London. The Atlantic churned with U-boats and convoy ships, American destroyers and German submarines locked in a shadow war that nobody officially called a war. But in Hawaii, the Pacific felt different. The sun was warm. The beaches were beautiful. The war was distant, something happening to other people, in other places. The men and women stationed at Pearl Harbor lived in a kind of in-between, not at peace, but not quite at war either. America had been supporting the British and the Chinese. Factories were humming. Supplies were flowing. But the United States wasn't officially fighting anyone. The nation existed in a state of tension, alert, but not mobilized, supportive, but not committed. For many Americans, especially those in uniform at Pearl Harbor, the real concern wasn't Germany or the Atlantic. It was Japan. Across the Pacific, in a nation of islands with limited natural resources, Japanese planners faced an impossible arithmetic problem. Japan had been expanding for years. Ambition drove them. The dream of a Japanese empire across East Asia, resources controlled, expansion guaranteed. But expansion consumed everything: fuel, steel, rubber, oil. And Japan had almost no oil of its own. The country depended on imports. Most of those imports came from places Japan didn't control: the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the United States. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, and as Japanese aggression in Manchuria and China accelerated, the world responded with pressure. Trade embargoes, sanctions, international disapproval. The supplies that Japan desperately needed began to disappear. By 1941, the Japanese military faced a choice that felt binary: back down or seize what they needed by force. Backing down meant humiliation. It meant surrendering territorial gains. It meant admitting that the dream of a Japanese-dominated Asia was impossible. Going forward meant war. War with whom? War with everyone in the region who stood in the way. War with the British in Malaya. War with the Dutch in the East Indies. War with the Chinese, who were already fighting. And inevitably, war with the United States. This is where Japanese military strategists hit a wall they couldn't break through with rhetoric or willpower. The United States had something Japan could never match: industrial capacity. American factories could produce ships, aircraft, ammunition, and materiel at scales Japan could only dream about. If this became a war of production, a war of resources, a war of attrition, Japan would lose. Every strategist in Tokyo knew it. So the Japanese military didn't plan to win a long war. They planned to win quickly, or more precisely, they planned to avoid losing quickly. The strategy was survival, not conquest. Buy time. Create a defensive perimeter. Make the cost of reversing Japanese expansion so high that America would negotiate rather than fight. It was a strategy built on a psychological calculation. Shock the Americans badly enough, and they'll hesitate. Disrupt their momentum, and they'll lose their will to fight. To make this work, Japan had to eliminate one specific threat: the United States Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet was based at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. It was the largest concentration of American naval power in the world: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft. If that fleet could be neutralized in a single stroke, Japan would have a window. A few months, perhaps longer, to consolidate control of Southeast Asia, to dig in, to fortify, to prepare defenses. By the time America rebuilt and counterattacked, maybe the war would be too expensive. Maybe public opinion would force negotiation. Maybe something would break in American resolve. It was a gamble, a desperate gamble based on hope more than certainty. But it was the only strategy that made mathematical sense for Japan. The problem was simple. Pearl Harbor was far away. The journey across the Pacific from Japan to Hawaii took days. Maintaining secrecy across that distance seemed impossible. If the Americans detected the Japanese fleet coming, the entire plan would collapse before the first shot was fired. So the Japanese military did something that seemed insane. They built a fleet of aircraft carriers. In the spring of 1941, a task force began assembling in Japanese ports. Ships were quietly gathered. Supplies were loaded. Personnel were isolated. Security was absolute. The task force included 6 aircraft carriers, the core of Japanese naval power. These weren't just transport ships, they were floating fortresses, each carrying dozens of aircraft. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, all trained, all ready, all aimed at a single objective. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. The fleet would sail north into the cold waters of the North Pacific, far from regular shipping lanes and patrol routes. It would maintain absolute radio silence, no transmissions, no signals, no chatter that could be detected. It would move like a ghost through the ocean, using the vast empty water itself as camouflage. Then, at precisely the right moment, it would turn south toward Hawaii. The aircraft would launch. The attack would be brief, violent, and overwhelming. And then the fleet would disappear back across the ocean before the Americans could organize a response. The carriers themselves would never be risked in direct combat. They would strike and withdraw. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the assumption that American aircraft on Oahu would be either destroyed or grounded, unable to counterattack, unable to find the carriers, unable to turn the tables. If it worked, Japan would have time. If it failed, the Japanese Navy would lose its most valuable assets on a gamble. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese task force departed from the Kuril Islands in northern Japan. The fleet included not just the 6 carriers, but also battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships, a complete strike force, everything needed for the attack. The men aboard these ships understood the enormity of what they were undertaking, though they were told only what they needed to know. Pilots were briefed on their targets. Officers were given their orders. Everyone was sworn to secrecy. As the fleet moved northward into the North Pacific, the weather grew worse. Fog rolled in. Waves began to build. The cold increased. It was deliberately chosen terrain, the kind of ocean space where merchant ships rarely traveled, where patrols were infrequent, where a large fleet could move without being spotted. The fleet maintained radio silence, no messages, no signals, just the ships themselves, moving through the gray water like ghosts. Days passed. In Japan, the High Command waited for news. Nothing came, which was exactly what they wanted. If there had been a radio message, it would have meant disaster. Back in the United States, military intelligence reported nothing unusual. There were rumors, always rumors. Intercepted communications suggested something was being planned, but the focus was on Southeast Asia, on Malaya, on the Dutch East Indies. Nobody believed Japan would attack Hawaii. The distance seemed too great. The defenses seemed too strong. The risk seemed too high. On December 2, 1941, the Japanese task force received a radio message, a final confirmation from Tokyo. The attack was authorized. The plan was go. The fleet altered course. It was heading for Hawaii. Back on Oahu, there were people who sensed that something was wrong. General Walter Short commanded the Army in Hawaii. Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the Navy. Both men were experienced officers. Both understood the strategic situation. In November, both had received messages from Washington warning about Japanese intentions. The messages weren't specific, no dates, no locations, but they were clear. Japan was planning something. Stay alert. Maintain readiness. Short and Kimmel increased some security measures, but they faced a dilemma. What was the actual threat? The obvious concern wasn't a carrier raid from across the Pacific. The obvious concern was sabotage. Japanese spies were known to be on Oahu. Japanese nationals lived in Hawaii. The threat of fifth column activity, infiltrators, saboteurs, people working for Japan from within the American base, seemed more immediate than a naval attack from thousands of miles away. So the aircraft were grouped together on the airfields, not scattered, not dispersed, clustered. Why? Because clusters could be guarded more easily, fewer perimeter points to defend, more concentration of security personnel. It made perfect sense against the threat they expected. It would prove catastrophic against the threat that was actually coming. On December 6, 1941, a Saturday, the task force was approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. The weather had cleared. The sea was calmer. Everything was in position. That night, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the plan, sent a final message to the strike force commander. The rise or fall of the Japanese Empire depends on this enterprise. Let every man do his utmost. Aboard the carriers, pilots tried to sleep. Some meditated. Some wrote letters to their families. Some stared into the darkness and thought about what dawn would bring. In Pearl Harbor, the base prepared for a normal Sunday. The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday in Hawaii. On Oahu, the sun rose over the Pacific. The weather was clear and warm. Servicemen rolled out of their bunks, some slowly, some quick. The pace of base life was different on Sunday, more relaxed, more casual, less urgency, less structure, more men sleeping in, more men planning weekend activities. At the airfields, the clustered aircraft sat quietly in the morning sun. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, hundreds of aircraft all in one place. At Pearl Harbor itself, the harbor was busy but not frantic. Battleships sat at anchor. Destroyers floated nearby. Cruisers moved in the water. The USS Arizona, a modern battleship, pride of the Pacific Fleet, was at its berth. Around it were other battleships, the USS Oklahoma, the US West Virginia, the USS Nevada, the USS California, others. Men were eating breakfast. Some were cleaning. Some were attending religious services. Some were standing watch, moving through the routines that never stopped, even on Sunday. At approximately 6 o'clock a.m., the first Japanese aircraft were launched from the carriers. Wave after wave of planes, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, took to the air. Hundreds of aircraft, all heading south toward Oahu. The noise of the launches would have been incredible. The roar of engines, the thunder of takeoff, the wind on the deck. But it was happening 230 miles away. In Pearl Harbor, no one heard it. No one knew. At 7:02 a.m., two American radar operators, Privates George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, were working at a radar station on the northern coast of Oahu. Their radar was relatively new. Most commanders didn't fully understand it. Most people didn't know what to make of the blips on the screen. But Elliott and Lockard knew what they were seeing: a large group of aircraft approaching Oahu from the north. The blip was unmistakable. The size of the group was substantial. Something was coming. Lockard immediately called the information center at Fort Shafter, the Army's command post on the island. A lieutenant named Kermit Tyler answered the phone. "We have a large group of aircraft coming in from the north," Lockard said, giving the direction and approximate distance. Tyler listened. He thought about it for a moment. The day before, he'd been told that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected from the mainland, arriving on this very morning. They were coming from California. They would be approaching from the north. Tyler's mind made the connection. It seemed logical. Likely, even. "Well, don't worry about it," Tyler said. He didn't sound concerned. Why would he? B-17s were Americans. They were expected. The radar was just picking them up a little earlier than anticipated. That was all. Lockard protested slightly. The blip was large. The size seemed bigger than the expected B-17s, but Tyler was confident in his interpretation. "Forget about it," Tyler said, and hung up the phone. Elliott and Lockard looked at each other. They had just reported something. The information center had been told. That was their job. They continued monitoring the radar. The blip kept coming. Closer, closer, closer. And then, at approximately 7:55 a.m., the radar screen went chaotic. The blip exploded into fragments as the aircraft descended over Oahu and scattered to their individual targets. Lockard and Elliott realized what had happened. Soldiers around them were already running. Alarms were sounding across the base. The war had arrived in Pearl Harbor. The first bomb fell at approximately 7:55 a.m. on an airfield. Then another. Then dozens more. The explosions began to crack the morning open. The sound of bombing is distinctive. A whistle, then a terrible compression, then a blast of heat and force. At Hickam Field, one of the main airfields on Oahu, the clustered aircraft became the first target. Fighters strafed the rows of planes, their machine guns lighting up the aircraft lined up on the tarmac. Bombs fell on the hangars and the runways. Explosions bloomed across the field. One moment, the base was peaceful. The next moment, it was chaos. Men who had been sleeping 10 seconds before were now running, trying to understand what was happening. Some thought it was an exercise. Some thought it was an accident. Some thought Japanese planes had been stolen or sabotaged. But the sound of bombs isn't ambiguous for long. "This is not a drill," came the radio transmission across the base. "This is not a drill. Japanese aircraft are attacking. Take cover." The words took a moment to process. Japanese aircraft. Those words didn't fit together with Hawaii or Pearl Harbor or Sunday morning. But they were real. The Japanese attackers had not come just to sink ships. If that had been the goal, they could have focused only on Battleship Row, on hitting the battleships at anchor, on maximum destruction of the capital ships. But the Japanese command understood something deeper. You have to paralyze the system, not just damage the symbols. So the attack was multi-pronged. Airfields were targeted first. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Iwa Field. Every airfield on Oahu. Why? Because if American fighter planes got into the air, the advantage of surprise would disappear. American fighters could intercept the slower torpedo bombers. American bombers could potentially counterattack. Reconnaissance aircraft could locate the Japanese carriers. So the Japanese pilots hit the airfields hard. They attacked the clusters of planes and destroyed them on the ground. They bombed the hangars. They strafed the runways with machine gun fire. They targeted fuel depots and ammunition storage. The goal was simple: keep the Americans grounded. Keep them blind. Keep them unable to retaliate. Battleship Row was targeted second. The USS Arizona, the U.S. Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, the USS Nevada, the USS California. The battleships were the symbols of American naval power, and destroying them had both tactical and psychological value. Torpedo bombers flew low, so low that the pilots could see the faces of the men on the ships. They released their torpedoes into the water, and the weapons ran true toward their targets. Dive bombers descended from altitude, timing their dives to release bombs that would penetrate armor and explode inside the ships. Key facilities were targeted: the oil storage tanks, the repair docks, the command centers. The goal was to create maximum confusion and minimize American ability to respond effectively. The USS Arizona was a modern battleship, 608 feet long, nearly 37,000 tons of steel and machinery. She had a crew of over 1,100 men. She was considered one of the finest ships in the American Navy. On the morning of December 7th, she was anchored at Pearl Harbor alongside other battleships. Her crew was going about the routines of Sunday morning. Some men were in the galley eating breakfast. Some were below deck. Some were on the deck performing maintenance. A Japanese dive bomber, a VAL, descended toward the Arizona. The pilot timed his dive perfectly. He released his bomb and pulled up to escape. The bomb fell through the Arizona's deck. It penetrated the armor. It fell deeper into the ship. And then, the explosion was catastrophic. A massive column of smoke and flame erupted from the Arizona. The impact was so violent that the ship's superstructure seemed to leap up. The blast was so powerful that it killed men standing on nearby ships. The Arizona sank in minutes. Over 1,100 men died, most of them trapped inside the ship. Most of them were never recovered. Most of them went down with the Arizona and stayed there. An eyewitness, a sailor on a nearby ship, described it later. "I saw the USS Arizona go down. She just went down. 1 minute she was there, and the next minute she was gone." The USS Arizona would become the symbol of Pearl Harbor, not because it was the only ship hit, but because the image of that massive explosion, that column of smoke, that sudden and complete destruction, captured something essential about the attack. But surprise has limits. As the attack continued, men began to understand what they were facing. They began to react. Anti-aircraft crews raced to their stations. The moment they could get to their guns, they started firing. The noise of the anti-aircraft guns became part of the symphony of destruction. The boom of the big guns, the chatter of the smaller guns, the shells exploding in the air as they tried to bring down Japanese planes. Pilots who could get to their aircraft did so. Some aircraft managed to get off the ground, despite being attacked. American fighters got into the air and engaged the Japanese planes. It wasn't much. The Americans were outnumbered and had been caught unprepared, but it was something. Sailors and soldiers who couldn't fight back directly began fighting to save their ships and their shipmates. Men in the water were pulled to safety by other sailors. Damage control teams worked to contain fires. Crews on ships that weren't directly hit began moving ammunition and supplies, trying to help neighboring ships in distress. The USS Nevada, moored at Battleship Row, managed to get her engines started. She began to move, trying to escape the conflagration. But as she moved toward the harbor entrance, she was hit by Japanese bombs. The pilots had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. A moving ship is harder to hit than a stationary target, but the Nevada was a large target. The bombs found her. She was hit multiple times. The captain, realizing that if the ship sank in the harbor entrance, she would block the channel and prevent other ships from escaping, deliberately ran the Nevada aground. It was a tactical decision that probably saved other ships later. The USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits on her port side. The torpedoes struck with precision. 1, 2, 3. The ship began to list heavily. The angle increased. The Oklahoma rolled over, capsized, her hull pointed upward like a vast, wounded whale. Men were trapped inside. Men on the outside scrambled to avoid being crushed. Rescue efforts were mounted immediately. Workers with cutting torches arrived and began cutting holes in the hull, working from outside to reach the men trapped inside. Some were saved. Some were found already dead. Some are still there. The West Virginia took so many hits, torpedoes and bombs both, that she sank at her berth. Smoke poured from her. Fires burned inside and on top. But the West Virginia didn't disappear completely. She rested on the bottom of the harbor, her upper works still visible above the water. Later, the West Virginia would be raised. She would be rebuilt. She would rejoin the American Navy and see combat in the later stages of the Pacific War. But on this morning, she was a burning, sinking wreck. At approximately 8:50 a.m., a second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived over Oahu. The second wave wasn't a surprise anymore. The alarm was already sounding. Anti-aircraft fire was already reaching into the sky. American defenders were already organized and firing back, even if they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. But the second wave came with the same objective: hit harder, do more damage, deepen the devastation. By this point, some American planes had gotten into the air. A handful of fighters were circling, looking for Japanese aircraft to attack. American anti-aircraft fire was more accurate. American ships that were still capable of it were returning fire. The second wave aircraft faced a different reality than the first wave. The window of opportunity was closing. Surprise requires a vacuum. It requires a moment when the enemy is unprepared. But that moment only lasts so long. Once the enemy understands what's happening, once they begin to organize a response, surprise becomes less of an advantage. The danger increases, losses increase. The second wave still achieved significant damage. Aircraft that had been damaged by the first wave were finished off. Additional targets were hit. But the Japanese pilots faced more resistance. Some Japanese aircraft were shot down. Some were damaged. The cost was rising. And as the second wave ended, the Japanese commanders aboard the flagship made a crucial decision. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Japanese strike force. He was aboard the flagship, the carrier Akagi, watching reports come in from the pilots. The first wave had done enormous damage. The second wave had added to it. But now, Nagumo faced a decision that military strategists still debate today. Should they launch a third wave? Arguments for a third wave were compelling. There was still work to be done. The fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor hadn't been fully destroyed. The repair docks were still largely intact. If Japan wanted to maximize the damage, to make American recovery as slow as possible, another wave of attacks would help. A third wave could finish what the first two had started. But arguments against a third wave were also significant. The carriers. That was the key. The aircraft carriers. Nagumo didn't know where the American carriers were. The USS Lexington was somewhere in the Pacific. The USS Enterprise was somewhere else. The USS Saratoga was on the other side of the country, being refitted. If American carriers appeared, if they found the Japanese task force, the Japanese carriers would be exposed. Battleships at anchor are one thing. They can't escape. Carriers are mobile. Carriers can be hidden. Carriers can run. But if discovered while launching or recovering aircraft, if caught with planes on the deck or in the process of refueling and rearming, a carrier strike force is extremely vulnerable. There was also the matter of fuel and distance. A third wave would consume more fuel. The return journey across the Pacific was long. If fuel ran critically low, ships could be abandoned at sea. Men could be lost. Risk versus reward. It was a calculation that Nagumo, an experienced naval commander, had to make in the heat of the moment, with incomplete information. Nagumo decided to withdraw. The signal was sent. No third wave. The strike force had completed its mission. It was time to leave. The aircraft that were still in the air were recalled. The crews aboard the carriers began the process of recovery, landing the returning aircraft, securing them on deck, preparing for the journey home. And the Japanese task force turned away from Hawaii. By early afternoon, the last Japanese aircraft had departed from Oahu. The sky over Pearl Harbor was empty of enemy planes. The attack was over, but its consequences were just beginning. In the hours after the attack ended, Pearl Harbor was a disaster zone. Smoke hung over the harbor. Some ships were still burning. The water was covered with oil. Men were in the water, some swimming, some floating, some fighting for survival. The sound of emergency equipment, of rescue crews, of men calling for help, it never stopped. Rescue efforts began immediately. Men pulled other men from the water. Medics worked frantically to treat the wounded. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The base hospital filled with casualties. Schools, warehouses, any space that could accommodate a bed was converted to emergency medical treatment. The USS Arizona, still burning, still settling deeper into the harbor, was a monument to the scale of the disaster. But in the midst of the devastation, something else was happening. The damage, while severe, was not total. The USS Nevada, though damaged and run aground, was still a ship. She could be raised. She could be repaired. Later, she would rejoin the fleet. The USS California sank, but not completely. She would be raised and rebuilt. The USS West Virginia sank, but her damage wasn't beyond recovery. But something else survived that would prove even more important. The repair facilities. The oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, the big fuel depots that supplied the fleet, were largely untouched. Those tanks survived. The repair docks survived. The machine shops survived. The ammunition magazines survived. These facilities were the infrastructure that kept a fleet alive. Ships could be damaged. Ships could be repaired. Damaged ships could be restored to service. A fleet could recover. If Japan had destroyed the fuel tanks, if they had destroyed the repair facilities, if they had destroyed the infrastructure, the American Pacific Fleet would have had to retreat to the mainland. The war in the Pacific would have looked very different. But Japan missed this opportunity. Whether by luck or by the incompleteness of the attack, the infrastructure survived, and that survival would shape everything that came next. On the evening of December 7, 1941, officers at Pearl Harbor began assessing the situation. The damage was catastrophic in terms of ships. But how many ships could be repaired? How many were total losses? The inventory came slowly. Sunk: USS Arizona, total loss. USS Oklahoma, total loss. USS Utah, a target ship, total loss. Several destroyers and auxiliary vessels. Seriously damaged: USS West Virginia, sunk at her berth. USS California, sunk at her berth. USS Nevada, run aground but repairable. Various cruisers and destroyers. Aircraft: 188 American aircraft destroyed, mostly on the ground. 159 aircraft damaged. Personnel: 1,177 killed. 1,143 wounded. On paper, it looked like an overwhelming victory for Japan. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled. America's ability to respond was severely limited. But there were two numbers that didn't show up on the casualty reports: the aircraft carriers. All three American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, were absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The Enterprise and Lexington were on patrol missions. The Saratoga was on the U.S. mainland, being refitted. This had been pure chance, pure luck. If the carriers had been at Pearl Harbor, they would have likely been attacked. But they weren't, and that luck would change everything about the war to come. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress. The speech is remembered for one phrase: a date which will live in infamy. But the deeper impact went beyond rhetoric. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. It was a formal request. It was a statement of intention. It meant that America was no longer neutral, no longer observing, no longer neutral in spirit, if not in fact. America was now a combatant. The vote in Congress was overwhelming. There were dissenting votes, one significant voice, Representative Jeanette Rankin from Montana, but the overwhelming majority voted for war. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The country that had been divided, some wanting to fight Germany, some wanting to stay out of the war altogether, some watching from the sidelines, suddenly became unified. Pearl Harbor had unified American sentiment in a way few events ever do. The shock, the surprise, the sense of violation, these emotions crystallized into a national determination. The United States was going to fight. Recruitment offices were flooded with volunteers. Men wanted to enlist. Women wanted to serve. The industrial base mobilized. Factories that had been making consumer goods began making weapons. The economic machine of America, the thing that Japanese strategists had recognized as ultimately unstoppable, began turning toward the production of war. Japan had hoped that Pearl Harbor would demoralize America, that it would make America hesitant, that it would force America to negotiate. Instead, Pearl Harbor had done exactly the opposite. It had awakened the sleeping giant. It had focused American resolve. It had unified the nation. The shock of the attack meant that for the first time, the entire American public understood, viscerally and immediately, that the country was at war. In the hours after the attack, rumors swept through Hawaii. Japanese troops were landing. A second wave was coming. The invasion was next. Martial law was declared. Blackouts were instituted. Beach access was restricted. Barbed wire was strung along the coastline. Some of these fears were based on reasonable precautions. Some were based on panic. But the overriding reality was clear. Hawaii was now at risk. Military units that had survived the attack, or that had been elsewhere on the island, began to organize. Machine gun nests were set up on beaches. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned. Infantry companies began patrols. The base that had been, 24 hours earlier, in peacetime routine, had become an armed camp. But Japan didn't invade. No second wave appeared. No invasion force landed on Oahu's beaches. Nagumo's decision to withdraw, to not launch a third wave, to not linger in Hawaiian waters, to sail back across the Pacific, meant that the American mainland was safe from immediate attack. And gradually, as the hours passed and no Japanese warships appeared on the horizon, the immediate panic began to fade. What remained was determination, anger, a desire to strike back. But that would have to wait. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was, by many measures, a tactical success. Significant American naval assets had been damaged or destroyed. American airfields had been attacked. American bases had been disrupted. American civilian morale had been shocked. Japan had achieved tactical surprise. The attack had come when and where Japan wanted it to come. The Japanese Navy had executed the operation with skill and precision. The pilots had been well trained. The plan had been well coordinated. From the Japanese perspective, in the immediate aftermath, the operation looked like a victory. Japan now had time. The window that Japan needed, the few months to consolidate control of Southeast Asia, to seize the resources, to fortify the perimeter, had been achieved. In the weeks and months following December 7th, Japanese forces drove into Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Indochina, and across much of Southeast Asia. American forces in the Philippines were pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula. Singapore fell. For several months, it looked like Japan's strategy was working. But there was a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of Japan's calculation. Japan believed that the shock of Pearl Harbor would demoralize America. That a quick war, a war won in the first year, was possible. That eventually America would tire of the fight, and negotiation would become possible. What Japan didn't account for was the totality of American response. Shock gave way to anger. Anger gave way to determination. Determination gave way to mobilization. And mobilization gave way to the full, overwhelming industrial and military power of the United States being directed entirely at winning the war. America didn't make deals with Japan after Pearl Harbor. America declared unconditional surrender as the only acceptable outcome. Japan had wanted to divide America, to weaken its resolve, to create an opening for negotiation. Instead, Japan had unified America and committed it to victory, regardless of cost and regardless of time.